Hi, and welcome to Experience Points by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. I'm your host, Dave Eng from Gamespace Learning by University XP. Find out more by going to universityxp.com. On today's episode, we'll learn from Zack Hartzman. Zack Hartzman is a licensed secondary school teacher in New York City. He teaches social studies and holds a master's in teaching from Columbia University. Zack is the founder of Hey Listen Games, where he designs and discusses educational video game curricula. As a member of the Games Awards Future class, he promotes games-based learning and advocates for its benefits on educational podcasts. He has also written two books, Teaching with Video Games, a Strategy Guide, as well as Teaching with Video Games, an English Language Arts Unit. Zack, welcome to the show.
Hey Dave, thanks for having me on.
Great. Thanks to have you. I'm really glad to have you here, Zack. I want to jump into the first question here, which is learning more about Hey Listen Games. Specifically, I'd like to learn more about how did your background in teaching inspire the creation of Hey Listen Games, and what specifically motivated you to integrate video games into the classroom?
Yeah, so I'll start with the motivation part. When I was in grad school originally, 11 years ago now, I had a professor who always advocated around incorporating graphic novels and film into our history classes. And so I already knew when I was going to be a teacher that was something I was going to pursue in my social studies courses,
Hmm.
which I did a lot in my global history and U.S. history classes. We watched Schindler's List one year. We watched Saving Private Ryan one year. We've read Persepolis when learning about the revolution in Iran, the Islamic
Hmm.
Revolution in Iran. We read a Magneto comic when learning about the Holocaust. So I spent a lot of time my first couple of years finding ways to incorporate comics in film.
Hmm.
And it always went super well because it's not that like comics and film are better than traditional books. It's just that when you kind of diversify the mediums that students engage with, they usually stay more engaged because it's fresh.
Hmm.
They're not just looking at like a white piece of paper with a block of text constantly throughout the year. So it's kind of important to rotate through the different types of mediums that you use
Hmm.
in your classroom. And I saw, and since I'm passionate about comics and film, and I saw that those were kind of working really well, I started to think about ways that I can bring gaming into my classroom since I've played video games my entire life.
Hmm.
And that originally started as just an after school club. And it was super popular. I'd have like 40 kids come to my room once a week to play video games after school. And then that evolved into doing it during lunch pretty much every day. My classroom kind of just became like a Super Smash Brothers
Hmm.
cafeteria
Yeah.
for like a year. And they were loving it. And I quickly saw that there's potential here to kind of bring video games into like my curriculum.
Hmm.
Um, Not necessarily a game like Super Smash Brothers, but
Hmm.
just games in general. So I
Yeah.
started dabbling with various video games. The first one I ever used in my socialized class is called The Republia Times. It was a game around propaganda
Hmm.
where you kind of manipulate the headlines on a fictional country's newspaper to kind of build loyalty or sow disloyalty.
Hmm.
And I taught that when they were learning about propaganda during World War II, and it went really well. So from there, I kind of just kept expanding different types of games that I was bringing in. And in each case, it was only like two or three a year that I would use. This is not really replacing the core curriculum of the class. It was more just like when I had time, what was a cool way I could bring a game in to kind of reinforce what I was already doing in my class.
Hmm.
And as I started to do it more, other teachers, and I was talking about it with teachers, they started to become more interested in it. And so I started leading some PD sessions in my network of schools. And then
Hmm.
from there, it just kind of a lot of people were telling me I should start sharing things online. And that kind of birthed Hey Listen Games. So I created a website where
Hmm.
I make the vast majority of my curriculum and lesson plans available for free. You just need to make an account.
Hmm.
Um, and then yeah, it just kind of became more noticed. It's not the most popular site in the world by any means. I put a blog post up like once or twice a year,
Hmm.
just kind of giving an update on the games that I'm using or new lessons that I made.
I see.
But it's been pretty cool.
Nice. Thanks for sharing, Zach. I think that one of the things that really resonated with me is that you really focus on video games as another form of media. I mean, you talked a little bit about using films in the past,
Hmm.
also using comics, and I often discuss this with other educators. Like games itself is another form of media. We're not really talking about using it to replace the media that you use right now, but like you brought up before, as a way to augment what you're already teaching.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Uh, I'm curious though. Can you tell me more about the title, Hey Listen Games? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so that my favorite game of all time is Ocarina of Time, The Legend of
Mm-hmm.
Zelda.
Mm-hmm.
And in that game, that's a game that I played, came out when I was 6 or 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I learned a lot from that game, just from like general vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
because there's no spoken dialogue, it's all text-based. So for like a 6-year-old,
Mm-hmm.
I spent a lot of time learning just the actual like English from doing it. It taught me like collaboration skills because I was playing it alongside my older brother, who I've
Mm-hmm.
always fought with, but not when
Mm-hmm.
we were playing this game. We actually worked together.
Yeah.
And there's a character in the game, Navi. She's like a companion.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you get lost or you're unsure, she would basically yell, "Hey, listen," at you,
Ah.
to kind of guide you on the right, to get you back on the right track or point you in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so from that, I kind of came up with the name Hey Listen Games, right? So it's like me kind of pointing you in the right direction to get you started using video games in your classroom.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
That clarifies it. I thought it actually came from the first Diablo. I don't know if you ever played the PC version, but
I
there's the
never
guy
played the
in the
original. I
town.
played 3 and 4.
Okay. Well, I remember I can't think of the character right now off the top of my head, but in town he sounds like a Sean Connery knockoff and he says, "Stay a while and listen." So I thought that it
Okay.
Hey Listen Games came from that. But I want to talk more about specifically your book, Teaching with Video Games, because I think this is where the most interesting part of a discussion will come about. Could you elaborate on some of the key principles and insights discussed in the book, Teaching with Video Games, a Strategy Guide? And specifically, how can video games go beyond traditional educational boundaries to teach things like problem solving, mechanics, and foster relationships, as you mentioned in the book?
Yeah, so the book is in like a couple of parts. It's more like a third of it is around pedagogy, a third of it is around how to get started, like technology wise, what do you actually need in your classroom? And then a third of it is a bunch of sample lessons that you could start doing. But around the pedagogy, it's more like the idea is all of us have gamers in our classroom,
Mhm.
like without a doubt. More than half of kids play video games now, whether it's console, whether it's PC, or on their phone. Like, and not even always playing. Like, there are millions, millions, millions of kids who watch people play games on Twitch or YouTube.
Mhm.
So they're engaging with video games in some capacity. And students learn best when you tap into their prior knowledge
Mhm.
and bring that into, right, that's part of like culturally relevant teaching, right? It's bringing in what they know and aspects of their life into the classroom to help them engage with your material.
Mhm.
So video games is something that they're using often on a daily basis, right? And I hear teachers constantly complaining about, oh, their students are not doing well because they're wasting time playing video games or they're staying up late playing video games. And I'm always like, okay, so use video games, right? They
Mhm.
will engage if you give them something around gaming, whether it
Mhm.
is playing a game in class, whether it's getting them to write about video games, right? You tell a kid to write a review about a video game and they'll do it
Mhm.
if they're into that.
Mhm.
Um, or give them like a game guide as a text that they can read, right? There's so much content around video games that we can use
Mhm.
with those kids, especially if they're struggling readers and writers, right? Get them to write about a topic that they're interested in and they'll do it. Um, and then also that's like pedagogy from the student side, but then there's also pedagogy from the educator side, where
Mhm.
we are our best when we bring our passions into the classroom, right? When we're passionate about something that's infectious, and so the students kind of feed off that energy.
Mhm.
So when I'm bringing a video game into class, right, it's because I like that game. I'm not just picking a random game that I find boring or that I don't like. I would never use that, right? So when I'm bringing in a game, it's something that I've enjoyed. It's something that I've learned from. It's something I think they can learn from, and then that
Mhm.
kind of just builds up the energy and builds up, like, helps create relationships between us, right? Because they can
Mhm.
see that I'm actually enjoying my job when
Yeah.
I'm with them in class.
Mhm.
That's the main gist of it.
I see. And I think you to circle back onto something you said before, when you started this original like club of students at your school, they were all gathered around like Smash Brothers. I'm assuming it's Super Smash Brothers Melee. Is that correct?
No, I mean, if
Oh,
it was up to me, it would be, but they were playing the Nintendo Switch one Ultimate.
oh, I see. Okay. Because I grew up with the original one on Nintendo 64, so I never really know which version people are talking about whenever they bring up Smash
Yeah,
Brothers. But you bring up a good point about going to where students are at. Like what is in the zeitgeist? What do they know? What are they playing on a regular basis, and kind of meeting them there. I think this is some of like, um, sometimes faculty members or instructors get criticism because they're using like classic texts, to base their curricula off of, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's kind of hard to relate to something that was written several hundred years ago. Whereas video games are very much contemporary. It's a media
right.
that's being consumed right now. So I think, like you said, meeting students where they're at, using this as a framework for teaching, learning, and education is a really like critical way of addressing specific learning outcomes, but using games as the medium in order to do so.
Yeah, and then it's not even just meeting them where they're at.
Mhm.
It's like I teach my main social studies class, but I actually do teach an elective English language arts class as well,
Mhm.
where we play video games as pieces of literature.
Mhm.
In my school in particular, it's a international school in New York City. It's a
Mhm.
100% immigrant and English language learner population,
Oh, okay.
right? So while
Mhm.
I'm teaching them content, I also have to teach them language,
Mhm.
and they're English language learners everywhere. They're not native speakers everywhere, and there are games that I use where there is no text, there is no dialogue. It's a story that's completely told around environmental or auditory or visual storytelling,
Mhm.
right? So you don't even need to read, but there is a story being told, and you can still teach them concepts like conflict, irony, point of view, perspective, um, and without their understanding of language bog them down.
I see.
An example is the game Unpacking, which came out 2 years ago now, where it's just a story. Like the gameplay is you're literally unpacking your box of stuff into your room
Mhm.
first as a child, but then the next level, it's clear, oh, you just moved to college and now you're
Mhm.
unpacking your things in a college dorm room.
Mhm.
And then you graduate and now it's like 6 years later, you're moving into your own you're moving into an apartment with roommates, right? And now you
Mhm.
have to unpack your things alongside other people's things, and then you have a partner, and then you break up, and then you get another partner, and then you get married, and there's a kid. So it's like, but none of
Mhm.
this is being said to you. It's all visual,
I see.
right? So and that's something that's not going to happen really ever in books,
Mhm.
and it might happen in film, but that if it's in film, they're not engaging with it
Right.
physically, right? They're kind of watching and consuming it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like we didn't explicitly say it before in our discussion, but games are this model for interaction. You can't engage, you can't play passively. Games are very much need that model of engagement.
Yeah.
And I think overall that level of engagement is something that is not necessarily new, but something that I don't think is used as frequently as other educators and instructors use. Um, but with that being said, I wanted to talk about the third and last question here, which is the Games Awards Future class. You're a member of the Games Awards Future class, and we talked about games-based learning as an advanced pedagogy, but not necessarily something that's new, or I wouldn't say something that's novel, but something that can be used as a way to promote games as a new form of literacy. Can you describe what the Games Award Future Class is and how you see the future games-based learning evolving in educational settings based on what you shared so far?
Yeah, so the Game Awards Future Class is so the Game Awards is every year hosted by Jack Keighley. It's a big event in the video game industry, right? It's sort of like the Oscars, but for video games, where they have like best game of the year, best performance of the year, and so on.
Mhm.
And starting in 2020, this is when I was inducted into this. I was in the first class.
Ah,
They chose 50 people. Each year they choose 50 new people from around the world
mhm,
that are the language they use are like diversifying the industry and making it more inclusive.
mhm,
Um, like creating a new and inclusive future for video games. And generally speaking, that's mostly just people within the gaming industry. So it's people who are making games, it's people who are talking about games, people who are writing about games.
mhm.
And in that first year, I was the only teacher,
Oh,
right? Which
interesting.
was really cool. So they chose
Mhm,
me. So I'm like, I was the only person that's not actually in the gaming industry, right? I'm in education,
mhm,
but I was chosen for it, which is awesome. And since then, each year they've chosen one more educator or librarian each year, which is awesome.
Ah,
So they're now making a point to highlight one type of educator every year that's using video games in some cool way in their schools.
I see.
And in terms of like the future of game-based learning, it's becoming clearly, at least in the social media sphere,
Mhm,
it's becoming more apparent that there are those of us that are doing this,
mhm,
right? Using video games in the classroom is still very niche. There are not a lot of people that are doing it. There are not a lot of educators that are comfortable trying that. There's still a stigma
mhm,
around video games for a lot of people and whether or not they can be educational.
mhm,
And I'm not talking about educational games. Like when I use video games, I use standard, regular, like entertainment games, just in an educational way.
mhm,
But it is clearly becoming more popular, right? When I tweet about it on social media, like I don't get pushback from anyone. Everyone's like, "Oh, that's so cool," and
mhm.
then they're often asking for me to share ideas and share materials.
Right.
And constantly, I do get messages from people who have tried my lessons or have bought my books, saying,
Mhm,
telling me how well that it went with their students.
mhm,
Right, so it is a slowly growing thing. I sort of equate it to like when I was a student in public school,
mhm,
comics and graphic novels were nowhere to be seen. That was not a thing that teachers were using in schools at all.
mhm,
But at least in New York, you go into any library and they just have sections and upon sections of manga and comics and graphic novels, right? And
mhm.
teachers everywhere are starting to use these as actual text in their classroom, right? So I feel like maybe 10, 15 years from now, video games will kind of be where comics and graphic novels are now,
Right.
right? So we're still in those like baby stages of really incorporating gaming as an aspect of education.
Nice, excellent. And I wanted to also point out because you'd brought it up before, I had seen you in the schedule at the last New York Comic Con because I had attended, but
Yeah,
not as a presenter. But I was glad to see that you were there, representing the field of using games for teaching and learning.
yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm just glad that you were able to get exposure to that audience. And I think that when I saw you in the schedule last, it was not your first appearance. You had been there multiple times. Is that correct?
Yeah, the past like 3 to 4 years, I've been doing a panel or two at Comic-Con.
Nice.
And I also do there's the PAX conventions in Boston. It's a
Mhm.
video game convention that usually every year I apply to bring five of my students to Boston to sit on
Mhm.
a panel
Yep.
and have my students actually talk about their experience using games in my class to a room full of educators.
Nice.
And that always goes really well.
And what grade do you teach?
Currently, in my social studies class, currently I'm only teaching high school seniors.
Hmm.
But over the course of my teaching career, I've taught 9 through 12.
I see. Excellent. Glad that you got to share. All right, so that brings us to our outro, Zach. Where can people go to find out more about you?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find me is probably on Twitter or
Hmm.
X, however you want to call it.
Hmm.
I'm at Hey Listen Games on Twitter. You can also head to my website. It's heylistengames.org, and I have a contact form on there. So if you don't use social media, just hit the contact form. It'll shoot me an email. Yeah, those are the two easiest ways to get in contact with me.
Great, thank you, Zach. I'm going to include the links to both your website and also your handle on Twitter in the show notes so people can check them out.
Awesome, thank you.
I hope you found this episode useful. If you'd like to learn more, then a great place to start is my free course on gamification. You can sign up for it for free at universityxp.com/gamification. You can also get a full transcript of this episode, including links to references in the description or show notes. Thanks for joining us. Again, I'm your host, Dave Ang from Game-Based Learning by University XP. On Experience Points, we explore different ways we can learn from games. So if you like this episode, please consider commenting, sharing, and subscribing. Subscribing is absolutely free and ensures that you'll get the next episode of Experience Points delivered directly to you. I'd also love it if you took some time to rate the show. I love to lift others with learning, so if you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with someone who could also benefit. Also, make sure to visit University XP online at universityxp.com. University XP is also on Twitter, otherwise known as X, at university_XP, and on Facebook and LinkedIn as University XP. Also, feel free to email me anytime. My email address is dave at universityxp.com. Game on.